Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today I am talking to a wonderful young man named Ben Levin, who has written a book, which I'm totally excited to talk about. The book is called In the Hole, and we're going to talk about, one, how Ben decided to write a book at such a young age, because most people don't do such a thing. But we're also going to talk about the book itself and sort of the meaning behind everything that's involved. But Ben, before we get talking about the book, do you want to say hello and give yourself a brief introduction?
Hi, I'm Ben Levin. I'm an autistic teenage author. I like spending time with friends, reading, writing, going on walks, that kind of thing. And I've been writing stories and books since I was 10.
Since you were 10, okay, so let's start there, Ben, because at 10 years old, most of us don't have any idea what we want to do. How did you discover writing?
I guess I always loved making up stories. What I typically do is when I saw a story on TV or read a book, I typically rewrite the story, usually under different names, usually with my Playmobiles and plastic animals.
Oh, cool.
And when I was 10, my mom kept accidentally referring to a story I made up as a book, and I thought maybe I should turn it into a book. So I did, and it turned out writing was something I had a lot of fun doing.
That's awesome. And I have to tell you, so I am in my early 40s, and I'm just now in my life starting to think about writing a book. I've sort of started writing, but I'm still playing around with it in my head. And it's not.
Go for it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the encouragement. I definitely do not write the way you do. It is not a made up story. It's actually the story of my life. But I can tell you, as someone who's in her 40s, I am definitely struggling with the writing part. So it's so inspiring to me that you're so young and writing comes so naturally to you. Did you have at any point in the process, even at 10, before you wrote this particular book, did you at any point second guess whether or not you should do this?
So there was this period. One thing that's always hard for me is when I spend a lot of time, I like on multiple projects at a time. But there are times when I'm really in the zone with one story or series. And when I'm done with it, it feels like I can't get back to my feet again. Mm-hmm. The biggest example of this happened in 8th grade when I finished writing one of my most beloved book series, Nellie's Friends. After I finished writing the last Nellie's Friends book, which I'd been focusing mainly on all fall, I started struggling to come up with ideas a lot. I feel like this was contributed to by 3 things. That was the year, well, 2 actually. That was the year when I finished a lot of my first few projects, my first 10 or so solos and series around that number. And I felt like, and I wasn't sure how to come up with something new now. It took me a lot of tricking. It was really tricky, especially since earlier that fall, I'd been praised when I said I'd written 80 books in 4 years. And that was 20 books a year. And that kind of got to my head, and I was focused a lot on my average, something which actually freaked me out during the next 2 years, having my average go down. And I also got very involved with electronic stuff in the years following, still am more than I'd like to say. In particular, I don't like video games because I blame them think that they're way too distracting for me, and every time I get into them, I get addicted to them, and as a result, I don't write as much. For the next 2 years, I was constantly hard on myself for struggling with my writing and struggling to come up with new ideas. It felt very intense trying. I went from a year where I wrote 20 or so books to a year when I only wrote 6. And my parents thought it was simply me putting in quality, not quantity, but I thought it was more. I was just not putting in the time to write more. This lasted until just before the pandemic when I started a new series and about a boy who could talk to zoo animals with his magic mandolin.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
And and after I started writing that, the ideas slowly started to come back to me.
I love that you touched on this, Ben, because I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast can relate because we as human beings tend to be really hard on ourselves, especially when we achieve something big and then we can't duplicate that or replicate it going forward. So I think a lot of people probably feel what you're talking about. And I wonder, for people who maybe might be in that stage right now where they feel like they're struggling and they're being really hard on themselves, what kind of advice would you give them?
Don't give up. Sometimes reforming ideas takes time.
That's such a great piece of advice. I love that. So you said when the pandemic started, you started this new series. Do you want to talk a little bit about that series?
It's something I didn't really continue with after a period of time. I only wrote 9 books in it. And wait, are you talking about Nellie's Friends or Zeke's Zoo Tales? Are you talking about the series they have coming in a month or the one I started just before the pandemic?
So I was talking about the one before the pandemic, but you can talk about either or.
So I'm not going to talk about Zeke's Zoo Tales because that project barely lasted a few months, even though by the time I was done with it, I'd kind of gotten my mojo back. But
so let's talk about the one that you have coming out then.
Okay, so next month, the first 5 books in my Nellie's Friends series are coming out sometime in the second half of April.
So you have 5 coming out all at once?
Yeah.
That's a lot.
4 of them were self-published a few years ago.
That's awesome. So now I have the question of, if you self-published, how hard was that process? Because I can't even wrap my head around publishing a book, let alone self-publishing.
It was actually easier because there were less critiques I had to go through and I had more control. The hard thing about it was the fact that you can't sell as many books on your own.
That's fair, I suppose, because you don't have the backing of a publisher at that point. So you've self-published. Obviously, now you have a publisher because this particular book you have a publisher for. So if you had to choose, what do you think, which process allowed you to be more creative?
I don't know. The thing is, I usually write all of my stories ahead of time before I decide to publish them.
Okay.
If I decide to publish them, I have a feeling that the majority of my stories I'm too self-conscious about and probably won't publish. But one thing I did notice was keeping me down a little was when I need to write for me. It's fun to write for a specific thing too, like for a club or for an assignment, or for something I want to publish. But I feel like I should also write just for fun.
I think just for fun is definitely the way to go with anything in life. Just speaking from personal experience, I get far more joy out of doing the just for fun things than the things I have to do. So, Ben, I do wonder, because COVID has happened and a lot of people have struggled over the last couple of years because life has changed a lot for people. Did you find it hard to be creative and keep writing during COVID?
No, for me, there were a few times when I struggled, but they were more related to OCD issues than like feeling like I had to, like what project work next had to depend on what music I heard or things like that.
Okay.
Mhm. But my writing actually, I came up with a lot of really good ideas during the pandemic time.
That's awesome. I love that. So do you have a whole bunch of stuff in the works for later this year as well, then?
Writing or publishing?
Let's start with writing, things you haven't maybe written yet.
There are some stuff. What I'm currently working on is this is the first super special in my book about a boy who loves reading and writing and who does stuff with friends and I also recently started a biography about Jackie Robinson. My
Oh my gosh.
biographies are the only nonfiction I write.
Wow.
I'm near the end of a book about World War II, and I'm also writing. I also am going to write a story about an MLB ball boy.
Oh my gosh. That's awesome, Ben. So, my question for you, because it sounds like you have all of these ideas, how do you decide which one to go with? I know you said you like to have a lot of projects at once. Do you just do a little bit for each one until you find the one that works?
One thing I've loved to do this past year is want to write about a specific subject. I like coming up with like maybe historical fiction or maybe a fan fiction or a musical. I like coming up with multiple ideas, three to four, maybe five. And then I like posting on Instagram to see what ideas people like best.
Oh, that's actually an interesting way to go about it. I never thought about posting to Instagram and asking people for their input. Do you think that because you have so many ideas at once, do you think that you will write for the rest of your life?
Yes.
I love that. I love that. You didn't even hesitate. I love it. Do you think that people who maybe are a little bit afraid to get into writing, maybe it's something they haven't done a whole lot, do you think that there's something that they could do to sort of encourage them to write a little bit more?
What do you mean exactly?
So if someone like myself has had the thought to write a book, but never saw themselves as a writer the way that you see yourself, what do you think people like that should do to sort of get into the writing mind space?
One thing they always tell people who, in order to get inspiration for writing, is read a lot of books, watch a lot of TV and movies, and live a lot of life.
Aww. That is like the best kind of life advice, not even just for writing, just like live the best life. I love that. Ben, if you could write about anything, let's say there was you had all of the knowledge you needed. There was one topic you wanted to write about that you have yet to write about. What would that be?
Very good question.
It's okay if you don't know the answer.
I'll have to get back to you on that.
No problem. I'm just curious because I think as someone who is just sort of starting to look at myself as a writer, I know for me, there's lots of things I would love to be able to write about, but I struggle with sort of deciding what is going to work for me. And I wonder, because you've been writing your whole life, essentially, whether or not there's anything you haven't covered yet.
There are a lot of things I want to cover in my writing.
You don't have to give me an answer today. It's okay.
I wouldn't mind. There are some political things I want to write more about.
Oh, okay.
And
do you think that maybe someday, do you think that you will continue being a writer and just doing books, or do you think you'll expand into other things?
I feel like because it's not completely likely, I can only write and still earn a living. I think I have to get a job after college, so I'm going to try being a teacher as well.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Do you think at this point you will teach people how to write and all of the process that's involved in that? Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so excited for that for you. I wonder, for everyone who is listening, do you have any advice, even if they're not looking to be a writer, they're just looking, maybe they've never tried something that they've always wanted to do. What kind of advice would you give them?
That's a good question. I guess the best I can come up with is something kind of cliche. Don't be afraid to try. Or I always tell people to follow their dreams. I guess I could say that.
Aw, I love that. I think that's great advice, even if it is cliche. Because I think often we judge ourselves as humans a little more harshly than everyone else does, right? And so we hold ourselves back from those things that we love doing. Before I let you go, Ben, is there anything else you want to share with everybody who's listening?
I think that's it.
Okay, awesome. Well, I have loved chatting with you. And typically at the end of the podcast, I will ask a few questions of my guest, but there's really only one question that I want to ask you. And it's, why does writing make you so happy?
I don't know. I guess it's just what I was meant to do. And I guess I just have a love for stories.
Oh, I love that. And I actually think that's the perfect answer because based on how much you write and how you write, I would say it's definitely what you were meant to do as well. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me on the podcast today, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, everyone who's listening. I will put in the show notes all of the links so that you can go get Ben's stories and you can follow Ben online as well. I appreciate you. Go ahead, Ben.
My Instagram, Ben Levin Author, and go to my website, benlevinauthor.com.
Perfect. I will put those links in the show notes for the podcast, and everyone listening can join you and follow along on the journey and see all the great stuff that you have coming out. So thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you all have a great week, and we will chat with you next week. Bye for now.